I was pulling in empty hooks all morning when an 87-year-old man at the dock looked at my cooler and asked if I was planning to eat air for dinner. His name was Curtis Webb. He'd been fishing the same pier in Biloxi, Mississippi since 1956, back when the Gulf was still wild and the tourist hadn't found it yet. He watched me cast again, waited for me to reel in nothing, and then he did something I didn't expect. He reached into his tackle box and pulled out a small container of baking powder. Not baking soda, baking powder, the kind you use for biscuits. He told me to trust him, mix a tablespoon into my bait, and see what happens. I thought he was messing with me, but I also had 0 fish and nothing to lose. If you're interested in seeing how these forgotten methods actually perform in real conditions, consider subscribing. That's what this channel is built on, testing old American fishing knowledge to see if it still works. No hype, just results. Curtis was born in 1936. He grew up in a time when you didn't go to the store for fancy scents and attractants. You used what was in the kitchen. His father fished commercially for redfish and speckled trout, and his grandfather ran trot lines during the Depression. Curtis told me baking powder wasn't some secret trick passed down like a family recipe. It was just common sense back then. You wanted something that dissolved fast, created a cloud, and didn't cost a dime. Baking powder did that. It reacted with water. It fizzed. It spread. And for reasons nobody bothered to write down, it worked. He said most people today wouldn't even think to try it because it sounds too simple. If it's not sold in a bright package with a logo and a price tag, it doesn't exist. But Curtis had been using it his whole life, and he'd watched it outfish live shrimp more times than he could count. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He was just telling me what he knew. I took a tablespoon of baking powder and mixed it into a small bowl with some cut mullet. The moment it hit the moisture, it started fizzing. Tiny bubbles formed around the edges of the bait. I coated each piece, let it sit for about 30 seconds, then threaded it onto the hook. Curtis nodded and told me to cast near the pilings where the current slowed down. He said the powder would create a scent trail that moved with the tide, and if there were any speckled trout or redfish holding near structure, they'd pick it up. I cast out. The bait sank slow. The water was murky that day. Visibility maybe 2 feet at best. I wasn't expecting much. Curtis sat down on his cooler and lit a cigarette. He didn't say anything, just watched the line. About 4 minutes in, I felt a tap. Not a slam. Just a soft pull, like something was testing it. I waited. Curtis told me not to set yet. Let them take it. Another few seconds passed, and then the line went tight. I set the hook and felt weight. Real weight. The rod bent, the drag clicked twice, and I started reeling. It wasn't a monster, but it was solid. When I brought it up, it was a speckled trout, maybe 16 inches, clean and healthy. Curtis smiled and said that's one. He told me to rebait and try again. I mixed another piece of mullet with baking powder, cast to the same spot, and within 6 minutes I had another hit. This time it was a smaller redfish, just under the slot. I released it and kept going. By the time the tide started to turn, I had landed 6 fish, 4 speckled trout, 2 redfish, all using the same method, all within 2 hours. Curtis caught 3 that morning using plain cut bait, no powder. He wasn't competing, he was just fishing like he always did. But the difference was clear. My cooler had fish in it. His had 2 small trout and a hardhead catfish he tossed back. I asked him why it worked. He said he didn't know the science, but he had a theory. Baking powder is sodium bicarbonate mixed with an acid, usually cream of tartar. When it contacts water, it releases carbon dioxide. That creates bubbles. Those bubbles carry particles of bait into the water column faster than they'd move on their own. Fish don't just rely on sight. They've got a lateral line system that detects vibration and pressure changes. They can feel those bubbles. They can sense the movement, and when the scent cloud spreads, it triggers feeding behavior, especially in low-visibility water. It makes sense when you think about it. Predatory fish are wired to respond to disturbance. A sudden release of gas, a shift in pressure, a plume of scent. It mimics the kind of activity that happens when prey is injured or dying. Baking powder accelerates that signal. It doesn't mask the bait, it amplifies it. Curtis also mentioned something else. He said his father used to add a pinch of baking powder to live shrimp when the water was stained or after a storm. It didn't hurt the shrimp, but it made them more active, more visible. The fizzing seemed to irritate them just enough to make them move erratically, and that movement drew strikes. He said it was especially effective in brackish water, where the salinity was shifting and fish were more cautious. I've since tested this in 3 other states, once in Alabama targeting channel catfish in a muddy river, once in North Carolina on a pier going after flounder, and once in Texas along a jetty system where the current was strong and the water was stained brown from runoff. Every time the baking powder bait outperformed the control. It wasn't a landslide, it wasn't magic, but it was consistent. And consistency is what separates a method that works from a gimmick that doesn't. The catfish test was interesting. I used chicken liver mixed with baking powder and compared it to plain liver on the opposite rod. Same depth, same rig, same spot. The powdered bait got hit first in 4 out of 5 sets. The fish weren't bigger, but they came faster. I think it's because catfish rely heavily on chemical detection. Their barbels are covered in taste buds. A bait that disperses scent more aggressively is going to register sooner. And in murky water, that's the edge you need. In North Carolina, I was fishing at night under the lights. Flounder were moving in with the tide, ambushing bait near the pilings. I used finger mullet, cut into strips, half treated with baking powder and half left plain. The powdered strips got picked up more often in the first 30 minutes. After that, it evened out. I think the initial burst of activity created curiosity, and once the fish were feeding, it didn't matter as much. But that early window made the difference between getting skunked and putting fish in the cooler. Texas was rougher. The jetty current was fast, and I was using whole shad for bull redfish. I dusted the shad with baking powder right before I cast, and the fizzing was so aggressive, it looked like the bait was carbonated. It didn't last long, maybe 45 seconds before it dissolved completely. But in that time, the scent spread wide. I hooked 2 reds over 28 inches in less than an hour. My buddy fishing 20 feet away with the same bait, no powder, got 1 small black drum. Same everything else. Different result. What I've learned is this. Baking powder isn't a replacement for good bait or proper technique. It's an accelerant. It takes what you're already doing and makes it more detectable. In clear water with active fish, you probably don't need it. But in stained water, heavy current, low light conditions, or when fish are lethargic, it can turn a slow day into a productive one. Curtis didn't invent this. He didn't claim to. He just remembered it from a time when people fished out of necessity, not recreation. They couldn't afford to waste time or bait, so they found ways to make every cast count. Baking powder was cheap, available, and it worked. That was enough. I went back to that same pier in Biloxi a few months later. Curtis wasn't there. I asked around, and someone said he'd moved in with his daughter up in Hattiesburg. I never saw him again. But every time I use baking powder, I think about that morning. About how a man in his late 80s took the time to help a stranger who was clearly struggling, not because he had something to sell, but because he believed the knowledge was worth passing on. 6 fish in under 2 hours using a tablespoon of baking powder and cut mullet. No special rods, no high-dollar reels, no branded scents. Just an old method that still performs when the conditions are right. If you value practical fishing over marketing, you might enjoy what we do here. Subscribing helps keep these tests coming, and it's how the channel grows. And if someone ever showed you a method like this, something simple that just worked, I'd genuinely like to hear that story in the comments.